Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our environment troubleshooting series. In this video, we'll go through why we might get blank readings and how to troubleshoot and solve them. Now, in the first video, we went into a bit more detail about how the environment system works. Now, if you haven't seen this, it's worth checking out, and I'll leave a link in the description section below, as this will help us in understanding some of the points that we'll be covering today. There will also be a timestamp in the description section below of the various sections that we'll be covering. So let's get started. So what do we mean by blank readings? Well, this is when we have one or more readings on the main display, or the monitor view as it's called in EnviroMon, that shows no readings, so basically a blank space. Now there's a number of reasons why this could happen. It could be a logger communication issue, it could be the logger getting into a glitch state, a network cable issue, a sensor issue, could be damage to the logger or the converter, or it could be a problem with the Convertor ID. So go through each of these points. If there's a communication issue between the logger and the computer, then all the readings on that logger will be displayed as blank. Now, it may be the case that you have multiple loggers, so all the readings on the other loggers will be fine, whilst the reading on your first logger will be blank. You'll be able to tell if the logger has a communication issue by exiting and restarting the environment software. If you get an error message that says logger not found on a specific port, then you know you have a communication issue. Make note of that COM port number, as you may need it later on. Now this could be due to a number of reasons really. It could be a problem with the power to the data logger. So it could be that the power supply is disconnected, or it could be that the power supply is faulty in some way. So ensure that the power supply is securely connected at each end, and check the power supply and cable for any damage. Now you'll be able to tell if the logger is getting any power by looking at the LED and seeing if it's flashing. If the LED is off, then you'll need to check the voltage on the pins of the power supply. If you're using a regulated power supply, the voltage should be between 14 to 18 volts. And if you're using an unregulated power supply, the voltage can go even higher. If the LED on the data logger is a solid red light, then the logger is in a lock state. Now you can reset the logger by pressing the reset button, which is situated in a small hole between the serial port and the LED, using a paper clip for a couple of seconds, and it should start flashing. Now, if you exit and restart the software, the readings should now appear. Now, it's worth noting that a reset procedure will erase any data that's stored on the data logger. So any data that wasn't downloaded onto the computer before this will be lost. Failing that, you may need to run the logload software, which will reprogram the firmware on the data logger, but I'll cover that in another video. Obviously, the connecting serial cable and adapters could cause a comms issue if they're not securely connected or damaged in any way. So have a visual inspection of the cables to assess any damage, and ensure that every connection point is securely connected. Now, another issue could be the serial adapter if you're using one. Chances are you're using a USB to serial adapter. It could be that the serial port address has changed, or it could be that the drivers were not installed properly or have become corrupt. You can find this out by going into Device Manager. So in this case, we're using Windows 10. So if you click on the Start button on the left-hand side there, and then type in Device Manager, and select Device Manager. And when it comes up, click on Ports, COM and LPT, and then click on the arrow to expand it. And you should see a COM port number that matches with the one that we made a note of earlier. If it doesn't, then there's a number of things that we can try out, and I'll cover this in another video. Now, if you do find that the actual COM port number has appeared, but you're still having an issue, what you might try to do is to unplug the USB adapter and then wait for a few seconds and then plug it in again and exit and restart the software, and that might sometimes solve the problem. Now sometimes the logger can get into a glitched state, which can cause some or all the readings to be blank. This can occur if there's a power cut, a power surge, or a grounding issue, or some kind of noise or interference being injected into the system. Sometimes just exiting the software and restarting it will fix the problem. Failing that, you can disconnect the converter cable or cables from the data logger and then connect them one at a time to see if everything appears again. So in this particular case, we're using both network ports to connect the converters to the data logger. So the first thing we'll do is we'll disconnect both converter cables from the data logger. We'll then wait for a few seconds, and then we'll connect the converter cables back. So we'll connect the first converter cable back, then wait for 10 seconds or so to see if any of the converters appear again. And once we've waited for 10 seconds, we'll connect the second converter cable back. And then wait for a few seconds again, and the remaining converters should appear. Now you may want to try disconnecting both converter cables again, and then just connecting the second converter cable first. It doesn't really matter which way around you connect to the data logger, as both ports are interchangeable. And then connect the other converter cable. Sometimes it's worth doing them in a different order. Now this usually fixes most of the glitch problems you get with the logger, but it could be the case that only some of the converters have appeared or none of them have appeared. In that case, we'll try something different. So I've rearranged the setup to connect the converters to one network port on the data logger to demonstrate this next point. However, if you've got converters connected to both network ports, this will still apply. So say for example, we had 10 converters connected to the data logger, and then we had a power cut, and the battery on the data logger was drained. It may be the case that when the power comes back, the data logger will require some help to get the converters to appear again. So what we're going to do is to disconnect the converter cable or cables from the data logger as we did before. So what we're now going to do is to introduce some of the converters to the data logger at a time. So in this case, I'm going to introduce one converter at a time to the data logger. So the first thing we need to do is to disconnect the converter cable connecting the first converter to the second converter. And then we can plug in the converter cable back into the data logger. And then wait a few seconds. The first converter should appear. So we can now introduce the second converter to the data logger. So what we need to do first is to disconnect the converter cable from the second converter to the third converter. And now we can add the second converter to the first converter. And then wait for a few seconds. We should now see the first two converters. And then we can add the third converter. So we'll need to disconnect the third converter from the fourth converter. And then we can add the third converter to the second converter. And wait for a few seconds. We should now have the first three converters appearing. And you can do this by going down the line. And if you've got converters connected to the other network port, you can do the same thing. The EnviroMon network cable, or as I like to call them, the converter cables, is essential to the EnviroMon system, as it transfers data to and from the converters and logger. It also provides power from the logger to the converters. As such, any issues with the network cable or the converter cable will most likely cause blank readings to a particular converter or multiple converters, depending on where the problem is. This could be a damaged cable or connector, or it could be that the cable had been pulled too many times, causing the cable to lose contact with the crimped connectors. Other issues could be a bad crimp or the use of a wrong connector. As we said before, some of the EnviroMon sensors use a 4-pin connector, which is narrower than the EnviroMon network connector. It will fit into the EnviroMon network port, but will be loose and will make and break contact. Now I'll cover another video about crimping connectors later on. One way of telling if the EnviroMon network cable is having a problem is by looking at the LEDs on the converters. The LED should be flashing every now and then, as you can see here. Now, if the LED is off, then most likely there's a problem with the power lines on the converter cable. And if the LED is flashing very quickly or solid, there could be a problem with the data lines on the converter cable. Now, there are a number of ways of identifying where a network cable problem is. You can do this by looking at the LEDs on the converters, and as we said, it should be flashing every now and then. So you can go down the system and look at the converters and see which ones are not exhibiting the correct behavior. Then look at the converter cables that are connecting them. So I've grouped the converters together so we can have a look at the LEDs to see how they can help us identify where the problem with the EnviroMon network cable is. So if we have a look at the software, we can see that quite a few of the readings are blank. So if we look at the LED on the first converter, it's flashing every now and then. This would indicate that it's exhibiting the kind of behavior that we'd expect. And if we look at the LED in the second converter, it's also flashing every now and then. So this would indicate that the converter cable from the logger to the first converter and the converter cable from the first converter to the second converter seem to be working fine. So if we look at the LED on the third and fourth converters, they seem to be exhibiting different behaviors. The LED on the third converter seems to be permanently on, whilst the LED on the fourth converter seems to be flashing very quickly. Now this would indicate that there's a problem with the converter cable from the second converter to the third converter and possibly between the third converter to the fourth converter. So we're going to replace the cable from the second converter to the third converter and see if that fixes the problem. So if we remove the converter cable from the second to the third converter and then replace it with a converter cable that we know is working, you'll need to give the LEDs a few seconds to settle. You can now see that the LED on the third and fourth converter are now flashing every now and then. And if we look at the software, all the readings have now appeared. So this shows that the converter cable from the second converter to the third converter was causing a problem with the third and fourth converters. So another way of identifying where a problem with an EnviroMon network cable is without looking at the LEDs if you haven't got access to them is to do very much like what we did with the glitch state, is to disconnect all the converters from the data logger and then connect them one at a time until we find where the problem is. So as you can see, we have 4 converters connected to the data logger, and when you look at the software, only some of the readings are appearing. So what we're now going to do is to disconnect the converter cable from the data logger and then wait for a few seconds. So now all the readings are blank. What we're now going to do is add the first converter to the data logger. So we'll disconnect the converter cable connecting the first converter and the second converter. And then we'll connect the converter cable from the first converter back to the data logger. And then wait for a few seconds. So we've now got the readings from the first converter appearing. We can now then add the second converter. So we'll disconnect the second converter from the third converter by removing the cable between them. And then connecting the second converter to the first converter. And then wait for a few seconds. So the second converter now has appeared. So what we can now do is introduce the third converter. So we'll disconnect the third converter from the fourth converter first of all by removing the cable between them. And we can now add the third converter to the second converter. And then we can wait for a few seconds to see if the readings have appeared. So we've waited quite a while now and the readings haven't appeared. So we know that there's an issue with the converter cable that's connecting the third converter to the second converter. So I'm going to swap the cable with one that I know that's working. So I'll disconnect this converter cable and add the one that I know is working well. So I'll connect the basically the second converter to the third converter, and then wait for a few seconds. So now those readings have appeared. So we now know that this cable has a problem. So let's go down the line and add the fourth converter to see if there was a problem with that. So we'll connect the fourth converter to the third converter. So now the fourth converter appeared. So as you can see, when there was a problem with the converter cable between the second to the third one, it also knocked out the fourth one. So depending on the converter that you're using, a faulty sensor could give blank readings. This particularly happens with the EL001 converter and the EL026 temperature and humidity converter. When they read open circuit, they will give blank readings. Now it could be that the sensor is disconnected from the converter, or it could be that there is damage to the cable or the connector or even the sensor. So have a visual inspection on the cable and the connectors to make sure that they're in good working order. Now I'll do a separate video about crimping connectors, so make sure you check that out. Now with other converters like the EL040 and the EL041 converters, they don't tend to have this issue as they will give you some readings, if not the correct ones, when they measure open circuit. If you're getting blank readings out of the EL040 or the EL041, then the chances are that it's not a problem with the sensors and it's a problem either with the converter or the EnviroMon network cable or something else. Now with the EL037 general purpose converters, this can take inputs from many third-party sensors or transducers, and as you can imagine, this is an innumerable amount. So depending on the configuration and the transducer that you're using, you could get blank readings if you have an issue with a sensor. But if you do suspect this, then give us a call, as every single transducer is different. And remember that we give free remote support. The EnviroMon system is quite a robust system and can last for many years. In fact, we have some systems that have been out there for over 15 years. Now over the years, some of the issues that we've seen have come from the ports from the data logger, converter and alarm units, where they've come off the PCB, or the pins have been bent, or there's been corrosion due to water damage. So the network ports should be fairly secure when you lightly wiggle the converter cable, as you can see here. You can take the converter cable and have a look at the port and see if there's any signs of corrosion or if the pins have been bent. A quick way to check if the logger or the converter is running okay is by looking at the LED. It should be flashing, as you can see here. This usually indicates that the logger or the converter is running okay. However, this isn't always the case. It could be that one of the actual network ports is running fine and the other network port is damaged, or there could be other issues. If the LED on the logger is off or is solid, it may be an indication that there is damage to the logger or the converter. However, this could also be a problem with the converter or network cable, or it could be the fact that the logger is in a glitch state, as we've covered earlier in the video. In any case, the best thing you can do is get the converter that you suspect is having an issue and connect it to the logger on its own, and try using each of the ports to see if it's working correctly. If you suspect there's a problem with the data logger, then also get a converter that you think is working fine and try plugging in each of the ports on the data logger. Other issues that we've seen over the years have been high voltages being injected into the devices, causing damage to the PCB and components. And other issues have been corrosion on the PC due to water damage. In any case, if you suspect that there is damage to your device, then get in touch with us. A converter ID issue could cause blank readings. As we discussed earlier, every converter requires a unique ID address to be programmed into them, from 1 to 15. Now, if two converters have the same address, one of those converters will give blank readings. Also, if for example you had a faulty converter and you replaced it with a working converter, but you didn't check to see if the converter ID addresses matched, it could be the case that you'll get blank readings, if not incorrect readings. Now you can change the converter ID by going into Change Address under the Utilities section. You'll need to unplug all converters from the data logger and only connect the converter that you want to program into the data logger on its own. Now I'll cover how to check the converter address and how to change the converter address in another video. So this concludes the video on the EnviroMon troubleshooting with blank readings. So thank you for watching and check our website and YouTube page for more information.